We have been discussing about the sources of knowledge, deduction, induction and abduction, and we have tried to explain the context, the challenges, the limitations and the contemporary relevance. I am Dr. Ananya Barwa in the Department of Philosophy, Associate Professor at Hindu College, and I teach this paper, Epistemology, for the 6th semester students, and this is newly introduced for the NAP syllabus. So now when we continue with our discussion, let us quickly have a relook about the contemporary relevance. And as we can see in the PPT here, the method of deduction, for example, the contemporary application, we have been talking about it is used in AI algorithms, formal logic in computer science, law. Example of case studies is in legal AI, example predicting legal outcomes, theorem providing in software. Induction, the contemporary application is in medical research, climate science, market predictions. Examples of case studies include COVID-19, vaccine trials, climate change, projections, predictive analytics, example Amazon's recommendation engine. Abduction, lastly, the contemporary application, scientific hypothesis generation, medical diagnostics, AI. Example of case studies, Einstein's theory of relativity, medical diagnosis, autonomous vehicle, decision making. So this is what we have been largely discussing in our previous lecture, and to carry on what we have been largely talking about the 3 methods of reasoning: deduction, induction and abduction, which continue to shape knowledge generation across various fields in the contemporary world. They allow us to reason logically, generalize based on evidence, and hypothesize plausible explanations in the face of uncertainty. However, each method, as has already been discussed, faces inherent limitations, making it crucial to apply them in appropriate contexts and combine them effectively to generate the most reliable and actionable knowledge. Now, what we have been doing was we have been discussing the sources of knowledge largely from the Western perspective. We would also here like to discuss the Indian perspective or the Indian epistemology and see how these 3 methods, deduction, induction and abduction, have connect with our Indian epistemology. So, Indian epistemology, as we understand, has a rich tradition of examining modes of reasoning and inference, which are often categorized in ways that overlap with the concepts of deduction, induction and abduction as understood in Western logic. Now, deduction, one can talk about the nyaya or necessary reasoning, which could be a correspondence in Indian epistemology, where we can talk about anumana, the inference as discussed in the nyaya school, aligns with the concept of deductive reasoning. So here, conclusions follow necessarily from premises, and it relies on a strict logical structure, syllogisms like example of a Nyaya syllogism, the Panchavaya Nyaya, which is the 5-part syllogism. For example, proposition, that is the Pratignya, there is fire on the hill. Reason, which is Hetu, because there is smoke. Example or Udhaharana, which is whenever there is smoke, there is fire, as in the case of, say, in a kitchen. Application, which is Upanaya, there is a smoke on the hill. Conclusion, Nigamana, therefore there is fire on the hill. This inference must be both a Vyapti, which is universally applicable, and free from fallacies, Hetva Bhasha. Induction, empirical reasoning, correspondence in Indian epistemology. We see Upamana, analogy and aspects of pratyaksha, perception, resemble induction. where generalizations are made based on specific observations. Now, this part where I have brought in the Indian epistemology is to only connect and brief the viewers that it was just not in the West that epistemology flourished. Indian epistemology has been thriving, and how. This lecture here is just an attempt to showcase that there have been various sources of knowledge in our Indian epistemology too, and some of which we can kind of connect with deduction, induction and abduction that we have been discussing. The key features. We seen in Mimamsa and Nyaya when discussing how empirical observation leads to knowledge. For example, multiple instances of smoke and fire together leads to a generalization that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So, Indian logic recognizes that inductive generalizations may not always be universally true, but depend on the strength of empirical evidence. Now, what about abduction then? We have seen deduction vis-a-vis our anumana. We have also seen induction vis-a-vis our upamana or analogy. What about abduction from the Indian epistemology? So, at the most we can say that this aligns with arthapati or postulation as explained in Mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta. Abduction involves inferring the best explanation for a given phenomena. So, the key features of arthapati is that it deals with cases where direct evidence is lacking and reasoning fills the gap. For example, if Devadatta is alive but not seen eating during the day, the postulation is that he eats at night, arthapati. It's not strictly deductive or inductive, but explanatory in nature. Similar to modern abductive reasoning, it aims for the most plausible explanation rather than absolute certainty. Now, in the broader Indian context, Indian epistemology, as we had just about mentioned, incorporates multiple pramanas or means of knowledge, including pratyaksha, which is perception, anumana, inference, shabda, verbal testimony, upamana, analogy, arthapati, postulation, and anupalabdhi, non-cognition. These methods show a nuanced understanding of reasoning that extends beyond Western distinctions. The schools of thought like Nyaya, Mimamsa, and Vedanta offer sophisticated frameworks for exploring inference and the limits of human reasoning. To explore how deduction, induction, and abduction are applied in Indian philosophical debates and comparing them with modern Western interpretation, let us delve into these reasoning methods with specific examples and their broader philosophical implications. Deduction in Indian philosophy and modern Western logic. Application in Indian philosophy, Nyaya logic. Deductive reasoning is most explicitly developed in the Nyaya system through the 5-member syllogism. Example, proposition, pratigna, which is, for example, sound is impermanent. Reason, hetu, because it is a product. Example, udhaharana, all products like pots are impermanent. Application, upanaya, sound being a product must also be impermanent. Conclusion, nigamana, therefore sound is impermanent. This rigid structure of reasoning has parallels with Aristotelian syllogism in Western logic, where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. However, Nyaya adds an empirical dimension by requiring the premises to be grounded in perception or verbal testimony. Now, let's talk about the modern comparison. Western logic, particularly formal logic, emphasizes symbolic representations and strict validity, which is Nyaya logic. In contrast, it incorporates practical examples and is less connected with formal systems, but equally rigorous in avoiding fallacies or hetva bhasha. Examples in Western logic, major premise, for instance, all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Both Nyaya and Aristotelian systems prioritize clarity and systematic reasoning but differ in their cultural grounding. Nyaya integrates Indian metaphysical assumptions. 2. Induction in Indian philosophy and modern Western philosophy. We see in Mimamsha and Nyaya. Inductive reasoning emerges in the process of generalization, Vyapti Jnana. For instance, observing fire and smoke together multiple times leads to a generalization that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. This generalization is then used in deductive reasoning to make inferences about specific cases. Example, the heel example. However, Indian philosophers are cautious about induction. They address the potential for error and emphasize the need for vyapti, which is invariable concomitance, to be well established through multiple observations. Induction in Indian philosophy and modern Western philosophy, the comparison. David Hume, a key Western philosopher, critiqued induction, pointing out that it lacks logical necessity, the problem of induction. Indian philosophy shares these skepticism, evident in the emphasis on pratyaksha and corroborative anumana. Modern Western approaches such as Bayesian inference attempt to formalize induction through probabilities, which contrasts with the Indian preference for qualitative corroboration. Now let's talk about abduction in Indian philosophy and modern Western philosophy. Abduction in Indian philosophy, again, Mimamsha and Advaita Vedanta, the reasoning or method of arthapati or postulation aligns closely with abduction or inference to the best explanation. Example in Mimamsha, if a person observes that Devadatta is alive but never eats during the day, the best explanation is that, as we had just about said, he must be eating at night. In Advaita Vedanta, the apparent contradiction between multiplicity phenomena and unity Brahman is resolved through adhyasa, superimposition, a form of postulation that reconciles experience with metaphysics. So abduction is widely used in Indian debates to address apparent contradictions or gaps in direct knowledge, emphasizing explanatory power over logical necessity. Now, we will be connecting abduction in Indian philosophy and modern Western philosophy, a modern comparison. Western philosophy treats abduction as central to scientific reasoning. Indian philosophy shares this pragmatic approach where arthapati often serves to bridge the gap between empirical observations and metaphysical principles. The discovery of Neptune, for example, in science was based on discrepancies in Uranus's orbit, leading to the postulation of an unseen planet, a classic example of abduction. Broader philosophical implications. Indian philosophy. Indian traditions focus on integrating epistemology with metaphysics and spirituality. Reasoning methods are not isolated intellectual exercises but are tied to understanding ultimate reality, moksha or liberation. Anumana, pratyaksha and shabda are not only tools for logic but also for uncovering deeper truths and existence. Modern Western approaches often separate logic from metaphysical concerns, focusing on technical precision and applications in fields like mathematics and computer science. However, philosophical movements like phenomenology and pragmatism reintroduce questions of meaning and human experience, converging somewhat with Indian holistic perspectives. So then, what are the key takeaways from the comparison? Similarities. Both traditions, Indian epistemology or Western epistemology, at the most we can say that they use deductive for strict logical reasoning. Induction is empirically grounded in both but approached with caution. Abduction or postulation fills gaps in both traditions, emphasizing explanatory power. The differences: Indian epistemology integrates logic with spiritual and metaphysical goals. Western epistemology, that is the period largely post-Enlightenment, often isolates logic from broader existential questions, though exceptions like Peirce or Heidegger exist. So we have seen that, be it the Indian or the Western, there is a connect, and one should understand that the difference is not in degree or in kind, but it is in degree. So the rigid structuring of reasoning, whether in the West or in the East, they have parallels with Aristotelian syllogism in Western logic, where the conclusion, I had said, necessarily follows from the premises. However, Nyaya adds an empirical dimension by requiring the premises to be grounded in perception or verbal testimony under deduction. Now, please understand that deduction in Indian philosophy and modern Western logic, the application might differ. Something about Indian epistemology is, as much as it is all about knowledge, or as much as it is all about the ways of syllogism, but the ultimate goal, after all, is moksha, or the spiritual awakening. So that has been one of the most resourceful distinctions between Indian epistemologists and Western epistemologists. Secondly, in Indian epistemology, we also have to understand that they have been extremely cautious when they have come up. For example, in the Nyaya logic that we had just about discussed, we see that it just didn't sum up with something like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. No, they had also come up with deductive reasoning with a 5-member full-fledged syllogism. This 5-member full-fledged syllogism, they understood, was essential to come up to the nigamana, or the conclusion. And just to reiterate, this 5-membered syllogism has been proposition, which is pratigna. For instance, sound is impermanent, that I had mentioned, and they gave the reason for that, which is hetu, because it is a product. Then they give example, which is udhaharana, all products like pots are impermanent. Then they also give application, or upanaya, which is sound being a product must also be impermanent. And then they come to conclusion, which is nigamana. That is, therefore sound is impermanent. So what we see is deduction in Indian philosophy, unlike in modern Western logic, has two more additional features. And this has been an interesting feature for in Indian philosophy. Again, if we talk about the larger philosophical nuances, we know that there is Shruti, there is Smriti, and there is also Nididhyasana. Shruti, as we understand, is the knowledge that we have gained from hearing. Smriti is that which we have gained from memory. And Nididhyasana is the applicability. So an interesting trait in Indian philosophy has always had been on the udhaharana, or the upanaya, the application, which the Nididhyasana also speaks. Without application, just gaining knowledge, just being Shruti as the source of knowledge, the Smriti as the source of knowledge, will not be complete. So there are definitely takeaways where Indian philosophy at times goes beyond Western epistemology. Unlike, as I had just about mentioned, the 5 full-fledged syllogism members of Nyaya, if we talk about, say, the Western philosophy, we see that they do not have 5-fledged systems, right? Remember, in our Indian philosophy, we had a proposition, a reasoning, an example, an application part, and then the nigamana, or conclusion. Unlike in the West, it is a very clear, three-staged process. There is a major premise, a minor premise, and conclusion. That's it. Major premise, all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So, in the Western epistemology, they arrive at the conclusion with just 2 plus 1 conclusion, 3-step process. But in Indian epistemology, it is a full-fledged 2 more additional steps, and that's a 5-step process. So these are some of the differences which we see in both Indian epistemology and Western epistemology. As I have said, again, the differences is not really in kind, but it is in degree. Further, if we again revisit Mimamsa and Nyaya vis-a-vis inductive reasoning, we saw that inductive reasoning emerges in the process of generalization via the Vyapti Jnana. Now, Vyapti has been a core component in most of the inductive reasoning. I think without Vyapti, the entire argument collapses. So, the Indian philosophers from the Mimamsa and the Nyaya traditions were vocal that, observing fire and smoke together multiple times leads to the generalization that where there is smoke, there is fire. So, this generalization is thus then used in deductive reasoning to make inferences about specific cases. But Indian philosophers were cautious about induction. They addressed the potential for error and they were quite mindful about it, and thus they emphasized the need for Vyapti. So, this is again another perspective where we see the importance of Vyapti being played in Indian philosophy, which was not there in Western philosophy. This is the second difference between Western epistemology and the Indian epistemology. Now, about abduction, when we talk about the Mimamsa and the Advaita Vedanta, we had said how the reasoning method of Arthapati or postulation aligns closely with abduction or inference. So, we had again cited how if a person observes that Devadatta is alive but never eats during the day, the best explanation is that he must eat at the night. Now, this very abduction in Advaita Vedanta, we see the apparent contradiction between multiplicity and unity, and that is resolved through adhyasa, the superimposition, a form of postulation that reconciles experience with metaphysics. And this is important for this is where Indian epistemology differs from Western epistemology, for as much as there is arthapati or there is abduction or there is postulation. However, the ultimate goal or the ultimate practice was to include adhyasa or superimposition to connect multiplicity, that is phenomena, with unity, Brahman. Ultimately, the main goal was to reconcile experience with metaphysics. So, at this stage, we can pick up these 3 differences between Indian epistemology and Western epistemology. The first is, quickly reiterating, in Indian epistemology, there is a 5-fledged syllogism, full-fledged member, and in Western, there are just 3. In Indian epistemology again, the emphasis on Vyapti has been extremely stringent, and they were cautious that no error should occur, and so the importance of Vyapti was stressed upon, whereas in the Western epistemology that is not seen. The third difference between Indian epistemology and Western epistemology is Indian epistemology was just not interested in gaining knowledge per se. Knowledge, yes, but there was also this underpinning of a form of postulation that could reconcile experience with metaphysics. For the ultimate goal has been by and large about moksha or salvation. So this is how these are the 3 major differences between Indian epistemology and Western epistemology. So in our today's lecture, we have discussed about the sources of knowledge. In the first part, we had discussed about the Western sources of knowledge, deduction, induction, and abduction. In this part, we have discussed, yes, about the sources of knowledge, but from the Indian perspective or the Indian epistemology. Thank you so much.